So today is the Yortzeit of the Chasam Sofer. And every year on this date we give a Shiur on Mishnosoi Shel Chasam Sofer. And we analyze one of the tshuvas and one of the fundamental psukim of the Chasam Sofer. The Chasam Sofer was probably the greatest halachic authority in his generation. And if the title Poisek Hador has become somewhat cheap in our time, one could say that the Chasam Sofer was the Poisek Hadoros, not only Poisek Hador in his day and age, and that was an age of giants. And the Chasam Sofer has a very special place in the annals of the development and the history of Torah Shebal Peh. So today we will once again analyze and go through and try to learn one of the tshuvas in the Chasam Sofer. Today's Shiur is dedicated L'arichas Yomeo, L'refuah Shalema, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu should sustain the good health of Ha'isha HaChashuva Etel Bas Sora Welcher, the mother of the Welcher brothers in Joburg in South Africa. She should have arichas yomim v'shonim and a refuah shalem and good health and nachas from her beautiful children and grandchildren. La'orech yomim tovim. Tshuvas Chasam Sofer or Chaim Siman Pei Gimel, the Chasam Sofer deals with a question which today bears less relevance. But until some years ago, special needs children did not have many institutions al taharas hakodesh. In recent years, we have developed an awareness that we too have special needs children and not only others. And today, in every major Jewish center, community, there are institutions al taharas hakodesh. But the Chasam Sofer deals with the question: a child that is mentally impaired, and by halachic definition, he would be considered and defined having the halachic status of a shoiter who is potom in a mitzvah. Could he be put into a institution in which he will eat nevelas and treifas? That's the halacha. The source of this major sugya being in Yevomes Kuf Yud Daled. However, lo safinen le biyodayim. And Chazal learned from three different sources: Dam shrotzem and tumas koyanim, emoy ve'omar tolahaze gedola malaktanim, that there is a clear prohibition to feed a cotton dvorim asurim, whether it's macholas asuros or in any other area of Torah. And most of the tshuva, the Chasam Sofer deals with the question: how do we define placing a child or a person in an institution? Would that be considered Safia Biyudayim? Because we are the one paying for him being in that institution, we're the one placing him in that institution, or maybe we're not the ones feeding him. He will eat by himself, or somebody on the staff of that institution will be feeding him. So the Chasam Sofer's conclusion is that that would not be defined as Safia Biyudayim. However, I want to analyze one point that Chasam Sofer makes because it's very fundamental. And it is a svara which I applied to different areas. So the Chasam Sofer says, we need to differentiate between two different cases, two different circumstances. If it is a school and there is a chance that they will advance this little boy or girl, and they will teach him, and he will progress, and he might achieve the status of a bardas, being chayev b'mitzvahs, that even if it won't be considered and defined as Sfia B'yadayim, I would be matir, argues the Chasam Sofer. Even though Sfia B'yadayim is an issa d'oraisa, I still would be matir. Why is that? Because the mitzvah and the necessity and the schus of bringing him into the status of being a bar chiyuva and enabling him to be mekayim taryag mitzvahs would override the issur of Sfia B'yadayim. And the Chasam Sofer proves his point from a very unexpected and interesting source. Shin Dalad Mem Shulchan Aruch HaChaim, we learn the halacha of Misha Mahalach B'Midbar Ve'eina Yodea Be'eze Yom Shabbos. Person is lost in the desert, and he lost Cheshbon. He doesn't really know what day is Shabbos. But he could retrace the day he left the Yishuv, and he could assume that he probably didn't leave home and embark on his journey on Shabbos. So every seventh day, starting off with the day he left home, he could assume is a weekday and not a Shabbos. So on that day he could do all the malachas. So that is the day in which he will cook and bake and sow and plow and do whatever he needs to do just for sustenance in the desert. All the other days he cannot do a malacha. However, he is allowed to move on and totally disregard Tchum Shabbos. Not only Al Payim Amma, which is the Rabbanon, even Yud Beis Mil, which is Tchum and Diuraisa, he totally disregards Tchum Shabbos. Why? Why is that? It is an Issa Diuraisa. Because it is our primary interest to get him home as soon as possible. And our objective is to get him out of the desert. And therefore, even though he is prohibited to do any other malacha, he disregards Tchum Shabbos. So argues the Chasam Sofer, what we learn from this halacha is, we're matir Tchum Shabbos, even though it might be an avera diuraisa b'kum v'asei, to get him home as soon as possible. We will not keep him stuck in the desert, and bringing him home and enabling him to be Makayim Mitzvah Shabbos b'chol proteil v'digdukei, who overrides Tchum Shabbos. And the Chasam Sofer learns a basic rule and a basic principle from this halacha. We will be mater sfia biyadayim, giving him a cholas asuros to enhance the possibility that he become a bar chiyuva and a bar das, and being mechuyev in all the mitzvahs. I think one could be mefakbek in this raya for three different reasons. One is brought out by the Chasam Sofer himself, even though in my opinion that is the weakest taina. So the Chasam Sofer argues maybe we would differentiate between the case in which a person is in the midbar, he's a bar chiyuva. He is a bar chiyuva, and he is mechuyev in Shmira Shabbos, and therefore we would enable him, and we would be matir, traveling more than a Tchum Shabbos, in order to bring him home and letting him be Makayim Mitzvah Shabbos b'shleimus. Masha Enkein, in our case, this child is not a bar chiyuva. If he's not a bar chiyuva, we don't have any chiyuv turning him into a bar chiyuva. Well, I think this is a lesser argument. He's not a bar chiyuva. He's also not a bar chiyuva lagabe macholos asuros. But the Yisra of Lois Afinim B'Yadar Mesapanas, not about him. But nevertheless, I think there are two different arguments which are, in my opinion, more powerful and stronger to be Mechalak, Ben Anidon or Ben Haraya. In the case of the person in the desert, it's only a Sofik Yisur, 1 out of 6 days. Only 1 out of 6 days is Shabbos. And he has to keep all 6 of them machmas hasofik. So when we enable him every day to go more than a Tchum Shabbos, each and every given day is only a sofik, right? Ultimately, he will walk each and every one of those days, but nevertheless, every day is only a sofik yisur. Argument number 3 would be, in the case of the midbar, the one transgressing is the one that ultimately will benefit from the transgression, and he will come home to Mokim Yishav and be Makayim the mitzvahs. In our case, it is the little boy that will reap the benefits, but it is us, and we are over on the Isra of Lois Afinim B'Yadayim. So are we entitled to be over and loisafine biyadayim to enhance the possibility that the little child ultimately will become a bar chiyuv? And this brings us to a big sugya. So Shabbos Davdala the Gemara says, Erev Lamed Beis the Gemara says, Nichale lachaved eliyeved isura zita v'loy leyeved amaoretz chavre isura rabba. And Tosfos and the Rashba and most of the Rishonim deal with this obvious contradiction. In Tosfos and in the other Rishonim we find two chilukim, two tirutzim. Shabbos Davdala the Gemara says, Hidbik bas betana. A person put a loaf of dough into the oven. Would another person be required or entitled to take it out, Radiyas Apasas and Rabbanan, to save, number one, from a Malocha Diuraisa, Afia and Bishul? The Gemara says no. In Erev Lamed Beis, we're dealing with a situation in which Mr. A said Mr. B Peres shel tevel, and only after he sent that fruit does he realize that he didn't be mafresh tumas amaisis and the peres or tevel. Would we say that Mr. A that sent the fruit should be mafresh tumas amaisis shalom and a mukaf, which is an isser, to salvage Mr. B from a harsher isser, a greater isser of achilas tevel? And the Gemara says, yes. Nichale lachavar. So Tosfos suggests two different terutzim. In Erevin, Mr. A bears responsibility. He is the one that sent that fruit. So he is the one that's machshel Mr. B, who relies on his righteousness, on his tzidkis, to eat that fruit and to assume it's probably not tevel. So he bears responsibility, and therefore he is the one to do an iser kal, to save his chaver from an iser chomer. Masha enkein hitbek pas betanar, and another person wants to save him from an iser. Second, Deretz and Tosfos differentiates between posha and loy posha. Hitbek pas betanar posha, and therefore you are a transgressor. Don't you expect somebody else to put his life on the line and to be over an iser kal to save you from an iser chomer? Masha enkein and eruvin loy posha. And this is a major argumentation in Orach Chaim Simshim Vov. Tshuvas HaRashba quoted in the Bis Yosef. Somebody rushes into shul on Shabbos to tell Reb Reuven, Reb Shimon, Reb Levi that his little daughter was snatched off the street by Christian missionaries and taken to the monastery, to the church. Is he allowed to be Mechala Shabbos, to salvage her? You might be surprised to learn that the Rashba says no. And the Bis Yosef says yes. And basically the argument is, which of the two terutzim are halachic ruling? If it's posha, that little girl loy posha, and therefore we should do an iser kal to salvage her from an iser chomer, and shemad is definitely an iser chomer against any other aveda, even chilul Shabbos. But if the accepted halachic approach is, it is only when we bear responsibility are we entitled and required to be over an iser kal to salvage another person from an iser chomer, then in our case, the father didn't do anything, he isn't responsible. The Nachlas Shiva, going back almost 400 years, Siman Pei Gimel Shalas Tshuvas, brings up another approach. An approach would obviously neither the Rashba nor the Bis Yosef thought about, or maybe they thought about it and they rejected it. But the Nachlas Shiva argues, Chalal olav Shabbos achas kedei sheyishmo Shabbos harb. This is a concept we find in Yuma Pehei, suggested by Reb Shimon ben Menashe as the source that Pikuach Nefesh Deicha Shabbos, Savora. Chalel olav Shabbos achas kedei sheyishmo Shabbos harb. So in humor, we're dealing with Hatzolas Odom Mimoves L'chaim Pikuach Nefesh. The Nachal Shiur broadens the scope of this idea. We're not dealing with a life and death situation, but rather with spiritual demise. But the Svara still applies, which is a big chiddush. But that is the opinion of the Nachal Shiur. And the fact that the Rashba and the Beis Yosef did not use this Svara obviously proves that in their opinion, this svara is not relevant only memoves l'chaim, not in any other situation. The Chasam Sofer alludes to this sugya, but he doesn't really go into a major in-depth discussion. So let's come back to the ruling of the Chasam Sofer, and the Chasam Sofer says, if the situation would be such that we could make progress with this child, teach him, counsel him, nurture him, and hopefully reach a matzav in which he would be a bar chiyuva, then there would be room for leniency to be matir sfiyah biyodayim. So I asked, well, yes, according to the Beis Yosef, being over once on an Isser of Sfiyah B'Yadayim to enable the child all his life to be a Bar Chiyuva and be Makayim many mitzvahs, that is a Surah Zuta against Mitzvah Rabbah, Loi Posha. Kiven Shaloi Posha, Oimram La'odem Chatei Kedei Sheyizke Chaveiroi. There is an interesting Sharat Zion, which always baffled me at the end of Siman Tov Reish Nun Hey. Sharat Zion deals with the question, could Reuven be over on a Shavuos to be Mezakeh Shimon with a mitzvah of Tkiyas Shofar? And the question is, and the Mishnah Berurah says in Sharat Zion, it's not Chatei Kedei Sheyizke Chaveiroi, it's Arvos. So, my responsibility that my fellow Jew should be Makayim a mitzvah is like my mitzvah, and therefore it's not Chadei Kedeshi Yizke Chaveiroi. And I wonder, so when do we say the concept of V'chi Oimram La'odam Chadei Kedeshi Yizke Chaveiroi? It is always service. So maybe the Mishnah Berurah differentiates between a mitzvah saseh and lavim. And therefore his argument is, if I'm over on a Shavuos to enable another person to be Makayim Tkiyas Shofar, it is as if I wasn't Makayim Tkiyas Shofar yet. Both Gemaras, Erev and Lamed Beis, Shabbos Tav Dalad, were dealing whether a person should do an Aveira Kala to save another person from an Aveira Chamura. But I still don't understand. The concept of Arvis refers to mitzvahs loisas just as it refers to mitzvahs asay. To the contrary, the basic source of Arvis is v'koshlu ish ba'avoin ochav kishiyesh b'yodem limchois v'loim mocho, dealing with Averis and not with mitzvahs. So, if Arvis is considered as if it is my own mitzvah, so when would we ever say or use the concept of and therefore I never really understood the svara of the Sharat Zion at the end of Siman Tov Reish Nun Hey. So even though we could dispute or argue against the Raya of the Chasam Sofer from Misha Mahalach B'midbar V'ein Yodea B'ezi Yom Shabbos, and the Chasam Sofer also alludes to the sugya of Chalul of Shabbos Achas, which we discussed, and the interesting svara of the Nachal Shiva. But nevertheless, I agree with the basic chiddush of the Chasam Sofer. And I don't think it has to do with Chatei Kedei Sheyizke Chaveiroi, because Lo Yisafinan B'Yodayim, just like Lifnei Ivar, is unique. True, it is our Isser, but it is all about him and not about us. It is about his mitzvahs. Lifnei Yever lo yisit mechshol, because we are responsible that another Jew should not transgress. And that is the same idea as lo yisafina le biyadayim, and therefore the focus should be he and not we. And just like he would be entitled to do an isakal, to salvage himself and bring himself to be a bar chiyuva, the same rule would apply lagabe lifnei yever or lo safina biyadayim. I think that some Sofer could have proved his point from Rabbi Akiva Eiger in Yoredei Siman Kuf Pei Aleph. Siman Kuf Pei Aleph, the Shulchan Aruch says, Noshim are not mechuyev in the lav of hakafas reish. Noshim don't have to grow payas. They also have no isur of being makif roishoy shel ish. However, when a woman is makif roishoy shel ish, she is over and lifnei yever lo yisit mechshol. Because regarding the lav of lo yisakifu, the Gemara says echad makav v'echad nikaf. Even the nikaf b'shev al tais is over and a lav. And therefore, ishu hamakefes roishoy shel ish is over and lifnei yever lo yisit mechshol. Rabbi Akiva Eiger is machadash a big chiddush. If the situation is such that if she wouldn't shave his head, he would do it himself. If he would do it himself, he would be oiva and shnei lavim, echad ha'makav v'echad ha'nikav. Therefore, it is preferable that she shaves his head, and then he's oiva on one lav. So that would not be an isur of lifnei yever lo yisit mechshol. True, she directly causes him to be oiva on a lav, but if she wouldn't do it, he would be oiva on shnei lavim. What we see from Rabbi Akiva Eiger is, regarding lifnei yever, we make the cheshbon. What is the other option? What will happen if we would not initiate and do whatever we're doing? If he would do it himself, he would be over of shnei lavan, and therefore mutar leish ol akif et haish, and that would not be an isur of lifnei yever. In a way, I think it's similar to the Chasam Sofer's psak. Just doing nothing will mean that this child will never have the schus of being Mekayim mitzvahs kebar chiyuva kemisha mitzvah v'oisa. So it is preferable to be over and lo yisafina le biyadayim, to enable him to achieve the status of a bar das and to be Mekayim kol mitzvahs ha'torah kedas uchedin. I wrote at great length, and this tshuva wasn't printed yet, but one of the shiurim I sent in Chol HaMoed was about this. As a general idea, we find in Poskim that sometimes it is mutar to do an isur bekum v'asei, when our goal and objective and the outcome will be saving the same inyan from being done by others in a manner that is far worse and more damaging than what we are doing. I'm fully aware that this is a very general agdara which we cannot possibly grasp without hearing examples. So let me just give you the most basic source. This is a tshuva in Mari Vail Simenun, quoted by the Ramon Yeredei Shin Sameches Sif Aleph and Embira Grosham. And the basic source quoted by the Mari Vail and Tumas Edition is Cheskio Melech Yehuda in Psachim Daf Nun Vav. Sefer Malachim Aleph Gimel we learn that Cheskio Melech Yehuda chopped off the doors of the Heichel. Kitzitz dalzas HaHeichel, and he sent them to Melech Ashur as a gift to appease the Babylonian king. He shouldn't come and destroy the Beis HaMikdash. Cutting off, chopping off dalzas HaHeichel is a lav, lo yisasun kein Hashem Elokeichem. But if Cheskio Melech Yehuda judged that is the only way to save the Beis HaMikdash from total destruction, that would be mutar. Even though, if the Babylonians, the Bavlim, destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, it is not our transgression. What could we have done? But nevertheless, Saving the Beis Mikdash would permit destroying part of the Beis Mikdash, cutting off the doors and sending them to Melech Baba. And I brought many different sources in which we find a similar concept and a similar yesod. Let me just quote an interesting shiur of the Chasam Sofer on Chelek Vav and Semeches, because today's shiur is dedicated to Mishnosei Shel Chasam Sofer. Chelek Vav Semeches, the Chasam Sofer deals with a very sad story. A kehillah hired an artist, and he wrote a beautiful shar, the posek Zeh Hashar L'Shem Tzadikim Yavoyu Bo. And they planned to put it up in the entrance to the shul, or maybe on top of the Aron Kodesh. And a Rosha came in the middle of the night, and he put that sign into the toilets, the washrooms. When members of the congregation saw that, they were shocked and dismayed. And the Chasam Sofer was asked, what could we do? And obviously there was no ability to detach it. So the Chasam Sofer writes, there's an issur of Mechikas Hashem. But in our case, Mechikas Hashem is Mishum Kvod Shemayim. Is there any greater Chil Hashem than having this posuk with Hashem HaMefoirish in the washrooms, in the bathrooms? So the Chasam Sofer says, Eis lasas l'Shem HaFeirish Sorosecha, and he is matir, erasing Mechikas Hashem. It's an interesting tshuva which has many different facets and many different yesodis which I dealt with at great length. To my dismay, I was asked many times similar questions. About 10 years ago, in Yerushalayim, maybe many of you listening to the shiur know where Har Chutzvim is, the big highway leading from the city in the direction of Ramot. One morning, people got up and they were shocked to see Yud Kei Vav Kei in big bold letters on the road, on the asphalt. And, we're living in a Jewish country, so the police locked off the road, and I was called by Idiyat Yerushalayim, and I said, take an Arab worker and have it whitewashed. Mechikas Hashem. So the Chasam Sofer is mata Mechikas Hashem when we're dealing with a tremendous and public Chilul Hashem, Eis lasas l'Shem HaFeirish Sorosecha v'gedoil Aveira L'Shmo. And another case, I was asked from a school in Yerushalayim, in which one of the kids, one of the Talmidim, went berserk for any reason, I don't know. Probably he was very hurt or offended. I don't know exactly what the story was. But when the janitor came in the morning in the school, he found that all the shirutim, all the bathrooms, hundreds of times Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei was written on the doors, on the walls. So the school called me and I said, first of all, don't let the kids into the school. I don't want any of the kids to see Vahoyo, to see Kabbalah, Sakoidish, and bring an Arab worker and paint it over. So I had many yesodis and many reasons for this heter, but primarily I based my ruling on the Chasam Sofer, and in a way, this is similar to Cheskio Melech Yehuda and to Shin Sameches Sif Aleph in Yehuda, in which Denamo quotes the Mari Weil, who bases his ruling on the story of Cheskio Melech Yehuda. So we dealt with the rulings and some of the yesodis of the Chasam Sofer in two different shuvas that in a way are related one to the other. So the Chasam Sofer was one of the greatest halachic authorities, and many of the yesodis of Psak applied today originate from the Chasam Sofer. Was the Chasam Sofer a machmir or a mekel? Depends whom you ask. And depends that person who you asked how thoroughly versed he is b'Mishnasei shel Chasam Sofer. So one of the famous axioms quoted in the name of the Chasam Sofer, maybe the most famous, Chodesh Osam and Atayr. The Chasam Sofer was in the forefront on the battle of our Messiahs. In the later days of the Chasam Sofer, the reform and the Haskalah was on the march. When the Chasam Sofer was a young boy, I think, Moshe Mendelssohn arrived in Berlin and opened a new chapter in the modern history of the Jewish people. The Haskalah movement. And in the early years of the Chasam Sofer was in the forefront on the Melchama on Kodesh Yisrael. In Hungary, total war broke out after the Ptira of the Chasam Sofer, and it was the Talmidim of the Chasam Sofer that rise to the challenge. Chuvas Maharam Shik and many other of the great disciples of the Chasam Sofer. So it is well known in the name of the Chasam Sofer, Chodesh Osam Min HaTorah. We should be extremely cautious with any chadoshes. We have our tradition and our Mesoros and Minhag Avoseinu Biyudeinu. So the Chasam Sofer was hostile, totally hostile, to anything that is new and different about Mesoros Beis Yisrael. But many of you will be startled to learn that the most famous tshuva in which the Chasam Sofer uses this expression, Chodesh Osam Min HaTorah, is in Tshuvas Orach Chaim, Siman Kuf Pei Aleph, and in that tshuva he rejects a chumrah and not a kula. That tshuva deals with the Shiur Esrog, and there were some that wanted to argue that the Esrog needs a bigger Shiur, and the Chasam Sofer writes, no, we cannot change our Mesoros, Chodesh Osam Min HaTorah. And by using this word, Hagedorah, Chodesh Osam Min HaTorah, the Chasam Sofer in that tshuva, Orach Chaim Kuf Pei Aleph, is rejecting a chumrah and not a kula. True, in other sources in Tshuvas Chasam Sofer, he uses the same expression when he is rejecting kulas. Two examples, Tshuvas Chasam Sofer, Orach Chaim Siman Chof Ches and Siman Kuf Mem Ches. Both of these sources he uses the same expression, Chodesh Osam Min HaTorah, while he's rejecting kulas. What I mean to prove is, true Gedolim of the caliber of the Chasam Sofer are neither machmira nor mekilim. They strive to learn Torah Emes, bein lekula ubein lechumra. So I do not think one could define the Chasam Sofer or the Noida B'Yehuda or other great Gedolim and Poskim. Were they machmirim or mekilim? They learned Torah Emes, and their rulings were pure. Torah ba'amitasa, bein lekula ubein lechumra. And we find in Yerushalmi twice, Masechet Trumas daf lamed amud beis, Masechet Soita daf lamed daled amud beis, Kishem she'asu letaher et hatameh, kachos letameh es hatoher. It is the same. Letaher es hatameh is a distortion of Torah Emes, and letameh es hatoher as well. Ukishem she'asu letaher es hatameh, kachos letameh es hatoher. Another famous expression which many people use when rejecting Koiche de Hetera is Borach Shem Mosar Oilomoy Leshoimrim. Understanding that Gedolei Yisrael are Shoimrei Habayis, and Keneged the Mekilim Borach Shenosen Oilomoy Leshoimrim. I think this expression Lemiut Zechraini is found only one time in Shas, and that is in Avodah Zorah Daf Mem Amud Beis. And in that specific sugya, the Gemara speaks about a kula and not a chumrah. Rebbe was ill. It was suggested that he drinks yayin tapuchim, but in yayin tapuchim there's a chash yayin esech. Rabbi Shmuel Rebbe Yossi tells the Rebbe that I remember when my great father was ill, and he was mekel and he drank yayin tapuchim. So Rabbeinu HaKadosh relies on the story, on the testimony of Rabbi Shmuel Bar Rabbi Yossi, and he drinks yain tapuchim, and he bounces back. And he is cured from his illness. And that is when he says, Baruch HaMokim Shemosa Olamai L'Shoimrim. The Shoimrim in that case are Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shmuel Bar Rabbi Yossi, who related the kula that one could be lenient with yain tapuchim. So Chodesh Osam in Torah doesn't necessarily mean that we have to reject every kula. Neither does Mosar Olamai L'Shoimrim. We need to learn Torah Zemes, lekula and lechumra. Ukishem shasur letaher et atoma, asur letamer et atorah. And we also always need to learn Torah Zemes bein lekula and bein lechumra. We should totally reject those that are always mekel, especially when there is no basis for kulas. We should also reject those that are always machmir. And every sugya and every halacha, we need to strive to the true understanding and the true havana, and that is part of the legacy of the great Chasam Sofer, the Godel Adoides. Most of later Gedolim were influenced by the rulings and by the derech of the Chasam Sofer. Schusay Togan Oleinu Val Kol Yisrael, we are living in testing times in every different aspect. In halacha, in hanhaga, and especially recently in Eretz Yisrael. Times of strife and bloodshed. Shekodesh Baruch Yerachem Aleinu. So in the schus of Talmud Torah, we're standing at the beginning of a new year, and the schus of our tefillas. Shekodesh Baruch Yerachem Aleinu Val Pleitas Amri Beis Yisrael. Misha Omer Lo Ilomai Dai Yomer Etzoloseinu Dai V'Tishkoit Ha'oretz. And we should know days of calm and serenity and peace. Lahagdil Torah La'adira. The schus of the great Chasam Sofer Yamad Lona Vel Kol Yisrael Shenes Borach Babona B'Chayim B'Mezoyne Ravicha. And this coming year should be a Shnas Geula V'Yeshua Lona Vel Kol Beis Yisrael B'Mheiro V'Yomeinu Amen.